Of myself, Kerry, of Rachel Ann, Thecla and Millie. Okay, so what is the problem? Well, a prominent problem in accessibility security is that systems are designed with the intention of a single main user, meaning an older user who perhaps needs some assistance doesn't have a channel to get that assistance. So our task was to design a prototype mobile application to assist these older adults in requesting and receiving help with configuring their security and privacy settings. So to achieve this, we had to facilitate communication for remote support and support personal recommendations and customizations. So with facilitating communication for remote support, there are two modes, push and pull. The push mode is a channel for a supporter to push relevant information to an older adult. For example, a notification asking if an older adult requires help. Whereas a pull mode requires the older adult to actively seek help, for example, messaging their supporter asking for help. Supporting personal recommendations and customizations has two modes as well, explicit mode and implicit mode. So explicit mode, supporters have to explicitly pre-configure recommended settings on their own devices for their supported user. Whereas with implicit mode, the supporter would share their behaviour data with the system, which would then act on its own to recommend settings for the older adult.
According to Ofcom, 4 in 10 of 64 to 74-year-olds own and use smartphones, as well as 27% of over 75-year-olds owning tablets. Although it is apparent that the older generations are using smartphones on a more increasingly regular basis, it is evident from Meck et al. Article that older adults rely on the support of individuals to help with complex tasks on their devices. From their study, they state 3 observations made from older adults using smartphones: passwords, fallback authentication, and privacy settings. It is common for children or grandchildren of older adults to know their passwords due to helping them often with technology issues. Although not planning to use it in a malicious sense, it is important that passwords stay as private as possible. The second, fallback authentication. Often, when setting up a new phone, the user needs to remember their email and password, which for some is a difficult task, especially if their supporter is in another location, and therefore they lack the opportunity to do so. Finally, it was found that privacy settings within applications and on the device in general cause issues for older users, specifically novices. We have taken the information from the background and the task set to design a variety of wireframes for facilitating communication and the idea of recommendations and customizations.
So these wireframes are for the facilitating communications between the supporter and the older adult. So as we can see here, the older adult has their settings open, in which case they get a notification telling them their supporter is online. The older adult, if they require help, can choose to start a screen share from this notification, otherwise they can just dismiss the notification. This gives them the freedom and flexibility to acquire help when they need it and not automatically just assume they need help. So assuming that they start the screen share, quite simply, the screen is then sent to the supporter can see what their user sees, and it also starts a FaceTime so that they have that face-to-face communication. The supporter can then talk the user through different changes to be made to the settings, and then when these changes are applied, the user can then exit the screen share, or presumably there would be some sort of timeout function to ensure that the supporter was not always seeing the screen.
The supporter view wireframes for facilitating communication. In the first wireframe, the supporter is made aware when one of the older users they support is online through a notification. They are then able to choose whether they want to show to the older user that they are too online and available to help, or if they are not. Once the supporter confirms they are available, the older user can make a request to start sharing their screen with the supporter in order to gain support. This will show as a notification to the supporter, and once again they can accept or decline the request. If the supporter accepts the older person's request, they are then able to see the exact page that the older user is viewing, allowing them to see the situation and giving them the opportunity to support them, whether it's changing settings or an issue with a specific application. From this point, the older adult can choose to start a conversation with the supporter if they want to, or they could have originally started with this option. The supporter will receive an alert stating that the older user wants to message them, similar to the screen share. Once the supporter accepts this, an in-app messenger is opened, allowing them to converse and assist the older adult until the situation is solved.
Now we go on to the recommendations view. Here we are seeing the screen that the supporter sees during this process. In screen 1, the supporter is presented with a list of users who they support, allowing them to manage all the recommendations in one place while making separate tailored recommendations for each older user. After clicking on a user, as seen here, clicking on Janet and being taken to her list of applications, we see all of the different applications that a supporter can help the older person manage. This list will show only the applications that that specific older user has installed. Therefore, you're not seeing a list of applications that aren't relevant, and it helps keep things streamlined and to the point. A thumbs up or thumbs down next to the application immediately lets the supporter know at a glance if the recommendations are being followed. If the recommendations are being continually ignored, they can then open up a dialogue with the older user. After clicking on an application, in this case Twitter, they see a list of all of the individual settings within the Twitter application. Again, we have the thumbs up or thumbs down to indicate whether individual recommendations are being followed. At the bottom of the screen, we see there is a toggle button which allows the supporter to import their own privacy settings as a recommendation. This is how we manage the implicit and explicit modes. Implicit mode would be where the user imports their settings, whereas the explicit mode would involve the user making specific recommendations for that older person. The recommendations are made on a per user, per application basis, allowing them to be highly tailored to the individual. Clicking on an individual setting then takes the user to a detail screen which lists all of the options for that setting. Initially, it will show them what their current recommendation is. This allows them to then make changes to the recommendation and save these changes. The thumbs up or thumbs down on the application screen will then update when the older user either accepts or rejects the changes in their view of the application.
So next we have the elderly user view of the recommendation screen. This was designed to be a particularly low-effort design, allowing elderly users to effectively streamline the process of just accepting the most secure option. As you can see in the first screen, the user opens an app. This could be Twitter, Facebook, or anything else that has privacy settings. And in the second screen, if the recommended privacy settings have been changed, they get this pop-up. Now, assuming that their supporter is indeed a trusted person, it is very likely they'll simply do the straightforward and easy thing and just hit accept changes, encouraging security by default. However, if they want to look and see exactly what's been changed, they can hit review changes, which brings us to the third screen. On this, they get the option to see both the old and new changes and toggle which ones they would like to keep. If they are still confused about this, they can contact their support member, allowing them to very quickly and easily establish why these recommended settings have been provided to them, what they all mean, and so on. This can help them to, over time, hopefully learn more about security, privacy, and what settings are important and relevant to them, allowing them to become more independent as time goes on.
Now, it is important when designing any application to consider the potential attack vectors that users might be exposed to. Users are generally vulnerable to side-channel attacks when they're authenticating. Some common side-channel attacks include shoulder surfing, where a user is observed while entering their credentials, smudge attacks, where fingerprints and grease marks on a phone screen reveal the PIN numbers or pattern entered, and thermal attacks, where when a user enters their PIN or pattern on a login, heat is exchanged between their finger and the device screen, warming up the areas of the screen they've touched. An attacker can then use a thermal camera to view the heat traces left and ascertain both the values entered and the order in which they were entered. It is through careful selection of an authentication method for logging into our application that we can reduce the risk of our users being targeted by side-channel attacks. One potential authentication method is to use something with multiple input modalities, making it harder to perform side-channel attacks, as more must be observed simultaneously in order to recover a user's password. For example, Gaze Touch Pass combines traditional PIN entry with users' eye movements. This makes it harder to shoulder surf, as both the eye movements and the user screen need to be observed at the same time. As part of the authentication, the eye movements do not leave any trace on the screen. Only part of the password can be revealed through smudge and thermal attacks. This greatly improves the resistance to side-channel attacks. However, a method such as this could be difficult for older users, as it increases the load on their memory. Now, as well as remembering the PIN numbers, they also have to remember eye movements. This is likely to lead to users writing down their passwords, which reduces the overall security of the application. Therefore, multimodal authentication is likely unsuitable for our older users. Instead, we could use biometrics, where an aspect of the person, such as their iris or fingerprint, is used to verify their identity. This would be much easier for our older users, as there was nothing for them to remember. This method is robust against side-channel attacks, as for example, observing a user authenticating with their fingerprint doesn't reveal anything of value to an attacker. Biometrics can therefore provide a fine balance between usability and security, and would be ideal for use when authenticating with older users.
So once we had our designs, it was time to evaluate them. We decided to evaluate them using a Think Aloud study. This is a study in which participants are provided with a list of tasks to complete on the wireframes or prototype, but are not given the exact steps on how to achieve them. While they are trying to achieve these tasks, they're encouraged to literally speak aloud their thoughts and their understanding of the application, giving us a greater insight into how it may appear to a new user. Due to time constraints, we ended up using a convenience sample mostly formed of computer science students of about our age, meaning this is not exactly reflective of how it could actually seem to actual older adults using this application. However, we didn't have the time or necessarily ability to go out and locate these people, so we are hoping to extrapolate what we can from these results. We performed a within groups evaluation. Participants were split originally into two separate groups, one to be the roles of elderly users and one to be the role of supporters, which may at first seem to be a between-group study. However, within these individual groups, the participants were presented with both of the screens. So elderly users saw both the facilitating view and the recommendations view. We used Latin squares to ensure that there was no learning effect taking place, or to cancel this effect out. And after each view, participants were asked to take a short survey, asking them their thoughts and opinions about what they've just experienced, and to kind of understand what bits that they may have found confusing, and if they, in the context of the Think Aloud, would have recommended that particular style of app to another user. Participants were also timed to give us a good indication of how long it would take for someone to complete the task provided. From our results, it can be seen quite quickly that the recommendation view was generally the preferred one. People in the role of elderly users seemed to prefer it, as they said they found the facilitating view confusing, and every single user who was in this group said they would recommend the recommendations view to another user in the same context, that of being an elderly adult. In comparison though, those supporters did generally seem to prefer recommendations view. It got a lower score when it came to how easy they found it to use, but there were no comments as to why this was the case, either spoken aloud or provided on the form. In addition to this, supporters generally completed tasks quicker using the facilitating view, and although they did mention some confusion over the role of the thumbs up and thumbs down emoticons. Despite all this, in general, supporters also seem to prefer the recommendations view. While we understand these two groups are not exactly entirely indicative of the true users for this application, we're hoping we can kind of extrapolate from these results and see that recommendations view generally seems to be the way to go.
So, quick summary, the recommendations view was favoured by both supporters and users, although the facilitation view was often quicker to use and found easier to use. There's no comments from either group that support this. How efficiently we defend against side-channel attacks is very much dependent upon the authentication style, with biometrics being the favoured choice. Further research is necessary as our user groups are not indicative of the target audience, but while that's the case, the research we have performed could be useful in showing for other groups such as those with severe learning difficulties or young children with mobile devices.